Good morning. I had to check the time again, make sure the video is running. How's it going? Here I am, Cassidy, on a actually pretty bright sunny day today. It's supposed to be a good day. I have things I need to do. Although I am not going skating today. I'm actually going to just take some time off and relax today. Though I do have to pick up a scooter and deliver it for our friend, our teammate with the broken ankle. It's actually not a broken ankle. She actually broke her leg close to her ankle. So it's not as severe a break as the one I witnessed in October, where the woman actually broke all 4 bones in her ankle. She broke both bones in her leg and both bones in her ankle. And that was rather horrific. This one, she snapped her fibula and tibia maybe about this far above her ankle. So they've put a plate in it and 2 screws, because by now all of us on the team have seen the x-rays. Yeah, we go so far as to actually post our x-rays in our group. We have a private group for teammates, and I was like, here's my x-rays, take a look. Yeah, I'm all fixed up. Yeah, you guys post recipes and crocheting patterns and pictures of your cats and dogs. We in Derby post our x-rays. And I know if I ever have to have x-rays, yeah, I'll be doing the same thing. Here's my x-rays, take a look. And of course, you know, this is the second teammate I know who has broken something and has had to have a plate put in, and the other one who did that, who is Panzer, who now as a ref calls herself Nita Nitro, so we call her Nitro now. When she broke her wrist, she had a plate put in her wrist, and she actually posted a picture of her x-rays with the title, "Look, I'm metal as fuck." Yeah, only Derby girls do this shit. Yeah. There was one time when I was down at York where Devour, the coach, she has a metal plate in her ankle, and she's like, you know, if you reach down here and feel my ankle, you can actually feel the screw. And she's like, go ahead, feel it. And I'm like, no, I don't want to feel your ankle. Thank you, but no. We're not, as we like to say, we're not real shy about our bodies. You cannot play Derby and like go, don't touch me. You know, there's just no way in hell. It's a full contact sport. You're always touching something. And if you're not touching something, you're in close proximity to a bunch of other women. About the only time you're not in close proximity to a bunch of other women is if you've been knocked down or knocked out of bounds and there's no one around you. I mean, and even then, the first thing you do is you get up and you can hear your coaches and stuff going, get up there. And that happened to me during one of the scrimmages. I got knocked down and I could hear my coach going, Cassidy, get up with the group, get up with the pack. And I was like, yep. And, you know, got on my feet right away and instantly like skated as hard as I could to catch up to the pack. So you're always hitting someone, you're always in the middle of something. You know, it's crazy. You can't be shy about your body. People are going to touch you. People are going to hit you, and you're going to show off parts of it that you don't want to. I actually, one night, it was so hot in the rink, I actually just took my tank top off and I practiced in my sports bra. Yeah. And, you know, I don't have what you would call a really curvaceous form. It's curvy, but in the sense that it's, you know, kind of filled out curvy. But I was like, fuck it. I don't care. And I've actually had Derby girls just strip off stuff in front of me and start changing. You really don't. You really lose a lot of your shyness about your body when you join Derby. But that was the one thing. It was one woman said, "Oh Christ, I got to change this," and she just stripped off her shorts and her pantyhose. That's what she was wearing because she wanted to put leggings on. And she was not wearing any underwear, and she was like, don't pay any attention to me. And I'm like, it's cool. And you learn not to stare. But the fact of it is, she just, dropped it right in front of me and stripped it off and put something else on. And it was like, okay. You just get used to it. I would never do that because I would be embarrassed because, well, my genitalia. What can I say? I would probably do everything I could to just not let anybody see that. But there'll probably come a time where I'll have to, drop trow or something in front of people. Actually, there was. When I did the penguin plunge, we actually were changing out of our wet clothes in the warming tent, and it was all women, and no one really gave a shit if they were in various stages of nakedness because you were freezing your butt off and you didn't care. Nobody was in there ogling anyone else because you're cold as hell and you're freezing your ass off. So, hypothermia has a tendency to prevent you from sexualizing the moment. So anyway, what's on tap for today? Well, I'm not going to talk about my personal stuff. And in fact, that's the only thing I'm going to talk about skating, even though I've been talking about skating a lot of late. But today I'm going to continue on with a thread that I've been carrying for the last couple of days. And it's sort of like, how did I get to here from the past? And I said I would talk a little about how my Annie and my Carrie sort of came about because of characters I wrote 25 years ago. And that's something I want to continue on. In some cases, you can't help but borrow from the past. There are some authors who have done that. Robert Heinlein did it every once in a while. In fact, toward the end of his writing career, a lot of his newer novels had to actually do with stuff that had happened in older novels. So it was kind of an interesting, It was kind of an interesting situation where he would actually bring in older characters, and sometimes you'd see the influence of an older character in a newer one. I think the last novel I think of his that I really enjoyed that had what I considered like an original character was Friday, which I loved a great deal. I know there were some people that just bagged on it. And even myself, toward the end of Heinlein's writing career, he seemed to get, I won't say preachy, but I remember reading The Number of the Beast and realizing that there were pages upon pages of nothing but arguments over like who should be in charge and all this other shit. And it got to be a little bit old after a while. And that was also the first novel I can remember of his where he started dipping into the Heinlein verse, I guess you could call it, where at the very end there was a party where like every character he'd ever created showed up. And there was a reason for that, because that was kind of the premise of the book, is that they had a ship that could not only hop through time, but could hop across dimensions. And his contention was that if you could imagine it, it could be created. So literary works that were read and thought of by millions upon millions of people. There was enough of a gestalt there that a universe would actually form around that literary work. So he actually had people going to Barsoom. He had people encountering members of the Lensman in the Lensman universe. And he encountered, characters from his own universes. That was why at the very end of the book, everybody from every novel he ever wrote about kind of showed up and came to a party, and had fun, sort of. It was interesting. So authors sometimes will borrow from the past, and there's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes it's the coolest thing in the world to do. And sometimes authors will borrow from themselves to make characters. That was one of the arguments I've seen about Heinlein's work. And I also seen this about E.E. Smith's, Doc Smith's work, the guy who wrote the Lensman series, is that their main characters tended to be a template of themselves. An idealized version of themselves, but themselves nevertheless. Or you could just do like Stephen King did and put himself in one of his own series where he was basically like, God. Why not? Because I've said that before, not so much about writing, but I've said that about role-playing, is that when you role-play with me and I'm the GM, it's my world, and I'm God, and I can do whatever the hell I feel like doing. It's the same way when you write. You are God. You're controlling your characters. Your characters are not controlling you. This is one of the reasons why I always get kind of bent out of shape whenever somebody says the characters were writing the story for me. No, they're not. If your characters are writing the story for you, set your novel aside for like a month and go back to it. Have any words been added to that book? No. You want to know why? Because your characters ain't writing the novel for you. Your characters are waiting for you to make them do stuff. Because, once again, you are God. Now, as everyone knows by now, I'm sure of it, Annie and Carrie actually arose out of a role play. I created Carrie. And I also created a number of the actual instructors who were at Salem. And a friend of mine, Tanya, she created Annie, and she also created some of the instructors that were at Salem. And in several instances, she actually helped fine-tune their personalities. She was the one that was really instrumental in making Coraline who she is today. Where I worked very hard to make Deanna and Helena and Erwin who they are today. Those were my favorite characters. She worked very hard with Trevor, though she actually played Deanna on a couple of instances. It was always curious to see how we would cross up with characters that we created. She said that there was times when, like, she couldn't play Helena because she understood that Helena had, like, this code. And the code was basically, if you get out of line, I'll kill you. And sometimes it came to that. But she never had any problems playing Coraline. She loved playing Coraline. And like I said, much of Coraline's personality is who she is today in the novel. And that came from Tanya. The one thing I really couldn't capture, and we had discussions about this, and we actually had an argument about it one night, was I had a lot of difficulty capturing the type of personality that she had for Annie. And I think that was just because she made that character her own so much that it was hard to copy it. I mean, I tried. And I'd ask her to look it over, and she says, well, you're getting closer, you're getting closer. I finally had an author friend of mine down in Atlanta, Diane, who's with, I'm going to get this wrong, but it's Norwada Press. she's good. She's a good friend. And we met once in Silver Springs, Maryland for dinner. And she finally told me, she says, you have to make this character your own. It's your novel. It's your story. Make it your own. You have to make Annie your own. If you can't get any real input from your friend, other than the fact you're getting closer, but she won't give you any actual definitive information, you have to make the character your own. Now, since then, Tanya's actually read some of the stuff where with Annie in it, and she says, I pretty much got Annie the way she was while putting my own sort of little twist on it here and there. And I felt good about that because she said she was pleased with Annie. There was nothing wrong with her. But again, the Annie that's in the novel isn't exactly like the Annie that was in the role play. Carrie, on the other hand, was 100% my creation. Up to and including what we know now is his bigender gift, which never actually came out in our role play, but it was something I discussed with Tanya. And in case you don't know the whole story, here it is. She was actually the first person I ever came out to and told her about it, because I had explained all this stuff about how I felt what was going to happen to Carrie. Carrie's biggest difference was Carrie's not transgender and never has felt that way. There will be a conversation he will have later in the current novel, if I ever get back to writing it, which I will one day, where he actually tells someone, I'm not transgender. I've never wanted to be a girl, so I don't understand why this happened to me. And because of what I was doing with Carrie, I felt I had to explain it even in further detail, and I finally told her, Carrie is kind of like a synopsis of who I am. And she was good with that. So yeah, she was the first person I ever came out to back in, I think that was August of 2011. That's how long ago it's been. So coming up on 6.5 years on that. But I go back a little further. And when I think of Annie and Carrie, as I stated in a blog post a couple of days ago, I think back to Cytherea and Albert. They were my first real complex characters that I ever created. And they first arose out of a short story that I wrote for my first creative writing class. And it was funny because we were told to write like a 2 or 3 page story. I think the one I turned in was like 12 pages, 12 or 14 pages. I can't remember, but it was around that. And the teacher was just kind of blown away by it. It was kind of an interesting concept. And at that time, I was playing with the idea of a bunch of time travelers who go around and, observe history and sometimes have to get involved in it. But then I started taking the concept, well, how did these guys get together? Because I knew 2 of the characters in the story came from the future, but one of them didn't. One of them was from the 20th century. Because he knew about some of the stuff that was going on. He knew it rather well because he'd actually lived through it. So I came up with the basic premise of Transporting, which was my first novel I ever started working on. And I started creating the 2 most important characters in it, Cytherea Warrington and Albert Dahl. Now, Cytherea's from the future. In fact, about 1,200 years in the future, she's living on a planet in the Hades Stars cluster, known as University, and the year there is, if you measure it in Earth years, 3182, or 3181 actually, when it starts out. So we're discussing the 32nd century here. And she is working with someone, a Dr. Thomas McCrimmon, who actually built this machine. He was actually trying to find a way of perfecting a faster than light drive, which they have, but he was trying to find something that would go a lot faster than their current faster than light drives. And instead he somehow got around causality and created a time machine. And he went back in time and through a number of coincidences, let's put it that way, they ran into Albert Dahl in 1986, October 13th, 1986, if I remember the date correctly. I was going back over and reading some of the early novel last night, reading some of the excerpts from what was then Albert's diary. Or was it Albert's diary? I'll tell you about that in a bit. Now, the two biggest differences with those characters for Manny and Carrie is that, one, they were both older. Both of them are like 28 years old when you first meet them, which means by the time you get to the end of the novel, because the novel actually encompasses nearly 2 years, they're pushing 30. So they're older. They're older versions. Cytherea went through a lot of changes. When I originally conceived her, I was on something of like an Anglo-English kick. And so I kind of saw her as coming from this interstellar empire, which was still a bit Eurocentric. And she was kind of this thin, prim, white, English-speaking person. Now, there was one black character in the book, but the characters themselves were exceedingly white. And that's because I started thinking about this in the 1980s, and frankly, I was a child of my time at that time. And people didn't think about creating people of color in their novels at that time. As time went on, as I began thinking about the novel and the world, I started thinking, in 1,200 years' time, there is going to be a lot of genetic drift. And you're probably not going to have the diversity of ethnicities in the future that you have today. One of the interesting tropes in science fiction is that you go to all these different planets and everybody's identical, except when you come to Earth. And it's like, Earth is never unified. Well, they have, but they haven't. I remember there was an episode of Babylon 5 where they were having a conference on the station, and it had to do something with comparative religions from different species. And it seemed like every planet that showed up, they basically have one religion, one belief system. And at the end of it, Sinclair is introducing all these different people from Earth who have all these different belief systems and are all these different ethnicities. And it's like, does that really make Earth special? That in 200 years' time, we're still divided by religions and ethnicity. Now, of course, everything was considered one, but still, it was a conundrum. I didn't really want to have a story that was like that. So I started thinking about something that Arthur Clarke wrote in Empire Earth, which deals with Earth's 500th, America's 500th anniversary. And one of the things he talked about was the genetic drift throughout Earth had become such that, no, I'm not going to York, it's 10 o'clock. The genetic drift had grown to a point that it was really difficult to find people of a specific ethnicity. Everybody had kind of started developing the same type of facial features due to ethnic mixing. And we're all developing kind of the same complexion. Now, there were holdouts in these areas, but they made a comment about how difficult it was to actually find someone who could be considered genuinely black anymore. It just didn't exist. And I know there's going to be some people saying, well, there'd still be billions of Chinese or billions of Indians, but, who knows what's going to happen in 200 years. So you start taking that forward in 1,200 years. And I began thinking that there would be certain planets that would be kind of ethnic holdouts. Like if you had a planet that was mainly settled by Scandinavians, you were going to end up with a species that basically was wildly blonde-haired, blue eyes, and maybe Caucasian. But you also have to remember that some of those genetic drifts occurred under our star system. And when you go out into the universe, you're going to be living under different stars, which means you could be living on a planet that's hotter. You could be living on planets that are colder. You could be living on planets that are dimmer. You're going to have planets that have less gravity, greater gravity. So you're going to get genetic drift there simply because the body has to adapt to living conditions. It's one of the things that came out in the Expanse novels, that people who live on the asteroid Sirius tend to be exceedingly tall because it's such a low gravity environment. The main character, Holden, who is a detective on Sirius, is like over 7 foot tall. And this was something that you saw in Larry Niven's Known Space series, going back to the 60s and early 70s. People who lived on We Made It lived underground because for 6 months out of every year, there were like 1,500 mile an hour winds on the surface, scouring everything in sight. So people lived underground. The gravity was lower. It was only about 2/3 that of Earth's. So you ended up, after several hundred years of breeding, with a species that was generally around 7 foot tall and consisted mainly of albinos. So you'd end up getting that sort of thing as well. And so one of the things that actually happened was when Albert ended up being brought into the future, which is exactly what happened. He ended up being like one of the only white people, white persons in the universe. Caucasians, true Caucasians, make up a very small percentage of the 68 billion people who now live in this small empire that spans across, dozens and dozens of star systems. So instead of saying, is he a person of color, it's more like, is he a person of non-color? And everyone tends to have something of a homogenized complexion. So Cytherea actually ended up, after several revisions, looking kind of like what you would expect if you had a cross between, say, someone from Indonesia or Malaysia or even China mixing with people from, say, the Middle East and India. And also one of the things I did with Cytherea, I let her keep her accent, which was kind of like a modified English. That was another thing that Albert ran into. He had to be injected with, like, translator microbes, I guess is the best way to put it. They were nanoids that affected the speech recognition patterns in his brain to allow him to understand what people were saying. Because English had drifted so much that what people spoke in the 32nd century was almost incomprehensible to him. And because she was a time traveler, she had to be able to speak standard English as well. So she had the same thing in her head to allow her to speak to Albert. And she was probably like about a size 14 or 16, because it determined that at some point in the future, no one's really going to give a shit about standards of beauty. Yes, you'll find people who are still a size 6. You're going to find people who are size 28. It all depends a lot on what planet you live on. With Cytherea, she was between a 14 and a 16 in what we would consider standard sizes today. So, she wasn't some skinny mini anymore. And she wasn't, had a healthy body type. She really did. It's quite different. Tommy's kind of skinny. And Lynette Wesley, who is the doctor who does special things, she's actually described as having something of an athletic build. She comes from a planet with lower gravity, but it's under an F-class star. So she's like 6.5 foot tall and black. She originally came from Africans from like the southern portion of the continent, northern South Africa, Nairobi, that sort of place. And they immigrated to the stars, and that's where her ancestors come from. And after generations of living under an F-class star on a planet with 80% the gravity of Earth, you develop an even darker complexion, like black. And you got tall. Albert was kind of an amalgamation of me, and of course at that time I was still transgender. I've always been that way. So one of the things I ended up doing was, Albert wasn't only taken into the future, but he was taken across different universes. I had actually begun working on the multiverse concept back then, and you learn that Albert was taken to a universe that's not ours. And if you read some of the clues that I leave in Albert's journal, you realize Albert comes from a world that's similar to ours, but not exactly like ours. And there's a major clue in the first journal entry that leads you to know that he's not exactly from our world. So he's from a different universe than ours. But what happened was, Albert is linked to another version of himself in another universe. And that version of himself happens to be a herself. Universes change when nexal points are created. And one of the nexal points it creates is, do you come out male, do you come out female? Well, Albert split at that point. And then split later down. He began exchanging bodies with a female version of himself, whose name was Audrey. And so every 2,500 days, he'd have what we would now see in Carrie as involuntary transitions. And he would switch back like regular clockwork from male to female to male to female to male to female. The advantage here was, Cytherea was a psychic. She was what they called a talent. She could do all these different abilities, psychic powers, levitation. She could do cryokinesis, which is manipulating things to make them colder. Audrey linked up with Cytherea and became what they called a twin. You're beginning to see where I'm forming some of this stuff now. And they became like this powerful gestalt. Alone, both of them would have had abilities. Linked together like that, their abilities became far greater. And so they were kind of formidable. Audrey had pyrokinesis, so they were fire and ice. A song of ice and fire. I wonder if George R.R. Martin knows this. It sort of was like that, yeah. It was, when I think about it now, it is sort of like a song of ice and fire. But, so there's part of where I got some of the linking between Carrie and Annie was there. I got some of the transitioning. Now, we know Carrie can now control his going back and forth, gender-wise, whereas Albert has no control over it, nor does Audrey. And basically, when Albert becomes Audrey, the mental portion stays, but the body changes. You might say it's almost like a quantum leap, which I kind of ripped off in a little bit process there, and I can explain that at some point later, but not right now. So you can start to see where I'm getting some of the ideas for what happened to Carrie. And some of Cytherea's personality rubbed off on Annie as well. Originally, Cytherea came across as rather cold and standoffish. Gee, do we know any girls from Bulgaria like that? You know, kind of. And as things went through in the first novel, something happened to Cytherea, and it allowed her to become more open and emotional. Again, do we know any Bulgarian girls that happened to? She was linked to somebody, possibly for life, again. And one of the things that Cytherea loved to do is she had such a magnificent control over levitation that she could actually fly. Anyone we know? I did. You know, I freely admit I took some of that stuff and I pulled it over. I gave Annie the ability to fly. I gave... Cytherea's not quite the ass kicker that Annie is, but she's pretty powerful when she lets her abilities crank forth. And Annie loves to throw those fireballs, whereas one of the things that Cytherea loves to throw are ice needles. She can actually form a group of frozen needles about this long, hundreds of them if necessary, and throw them at high velocity at someone. It's like getting hit with 100 flechettes traveling at, 300 miles an hour or 500 kilometers an hour. If it hits your body, it's just going to tear you to shreds. And she's really good at doing that. That's like one of her go-to signature attacks is, an ice sliver attack. Yeah, it's pretty good. So Annie doesn't do that. She just throws fireballs. But if you notice, Annie's learning to manipulate water now. So is Carrie. The biggest difference between Albert/Audrey and Carrie/female Carrie is that while Carrie has depression, and we're beginning to learn this, we know Carrie now has depression. Coraline's called it. Albert and Audrey were bipolar, and not only bipolar, but suicidal. The novel actually starts out with Albert getting ready to kill himself. He really does. And he's stopped basically at the last moment, probably within a few hours of ending his life. Later in the book, you see the same thing happen. Albert is in such a state of depression. He wants to die, and that translates over into Audrey wanting to die as well. And she even says it. I've had enough. Why can't I just die? So it's a problem that they deal with throughout the first book, is that her bipolar and his bipolar tendencies are so great. But the biggest problem they have is the sort of medication that would bring it under control could also affect her, Audrey's, psychic abilities. So, she gets counseling, but that's about it. It's really, it's really something that I put in there simply because of my own mental state from time to time. This is things that I have felt, things that I've had to deal with. And I thought that this was a way of actually translating it in a way that made sense to me. And it's kind of hard to go back and read some of that stuff now because, trying to write about someone who's just just plain suicidal. It was rough. And I was going through a lot of that at the time, from time to time when I've written a book. I mean, I've never been shy about the fact that I suffer from suicidal ideation. Even today, I mean, the month of January was not one of my greatest. And there were times there where it was like, don't go out on your balcony. You do not want to go out on your balcony. Don't do that, because you may not come back. One of the other things that translated over to Albert was Carrie loves to fly on his broom. Albert loved to fly too. With the interesting thing being, Albert suffered from a fear of heights, which is kind of unusual because he lives with Cytherea in a condo that is actually perched a kilometer up on the side of a sheer cliff. And their dining room can actually be made so that the walls and the ceilings and the floor are completely translucent, so there's nothing but sky around you, and it freaks him out. He has a hard time going in there. The floor, generally, they can't leave it translucent because he won't walk into the room. It's hard for him to do so. It's the same thing when he first started going down the stairs from the upper living level to the lower level, which is used for entertainment, and it was actually where his first room was. And as you're going down the stairs, there's this huge wall of glass that's looking along the cliffside, and there's nothing there but, air. So he had to learn to actually, not get close to it. Even though there was no possibility of any of this stuff ever falling off the cliff. It just wasn't going to happen. His fear of heights kicked in. But he loved to fly, and he loved to go into space. He actually had a hybrid spacecraft. It could take off from the ground and fly into space. It could also fly like a jet. It had jet engines which could convert into scramjets, which could convert into rocket engines. And given the sort of technology they had, the engines could propel the craft at an acceleration of up to 30 times normal gravity. And the reason they could do this is because, hey, artificial gravity and inertia dampeners, which was why he never feared flying. Because there was very little in the way of turbulence or anything like that. And he was cocooned in this nice ship, which basically was made out of force fields, constructed from energy fields. And it was stated that he could probably crash it into a mountain at about Mach 10 and still survive. So his fear of heights when flying really went away. It didn't bother him. But if he was on an open structure, say 300 meters up in the air, he'd start freaking out. He didn't like it. He had a severe fear of heights. So did Audrey. So that's kind of where a lot of the personality of those two and a lot of the setup came from that beginning. And I'm not ashamed to say, I took stuff from those early novels. That early novel, because I don't ever intend on publishing it. Or maybe I will, who knows. It was the first novel, when I kind of look back on it, there's a part of me that says, it's good, but there's another part of me that's saying, you don't ever want to publish this because it's kind of rough. And I was even reading some stuff last night. It was like, at the time I wrote it, back in the 90s, the concept of gender was still kind of not solidified, let's say, the way we know it today. And Tommy is thinking to himself that he'll call Audrey a she because it's just too damn hard to call her a he because of all the gender pronouns were messing up his head. That's a product of that time. In the future, nowadays, and that's me not thinking far enough in the future, thinking that even by now, we've reached a point where, some people still have problems with gender pronouns. But in the future it would be like, they would probably ask Audrey, how do you want to be addressed? Are you a she? Are you a he? And the reality is that Audrey's a she. She admits that. She feels female. She actually identifies as female, although it's somewhat confusing to her. It's the same thing with Carrie. Carrie, it's kind of been established that when Carrie's in female form, Carrie identifies as female. We haven't gotten that confirmation yet, but you kind of get the impression that, Carrie doesn't have a problem identifying as female. But we'll get a confirmation on which way it actually goes later in the novel. But for right now, Carrie seems to be comfortable identifying as female. It's not a problem. So that's one of those things that if I were to go back and rewrite those portions today, I would completely redo that. Because when I looked at it, I was actually reading it last night. I'm reading this, I'm going, oh my God, this is so stupid. Tommy would naturally ask her, so would Lynette, how do you identify? Are you female? Are you male? How do you want us to address you, she or he? You would automatically know to ask about what pronoun use you want, because that's something those of us who have went through this thing and have people who know we've went through this thing sort of adopt today. What are your pronouns? I mean, I have been at places where, hi, my name is Cassidy, and my pronouns, it even says it, and my pronouns are, and I'll write she, her, hers, because that's how I identify. Simple. That's just a case of, like I said, I wrote that decades ago, and I wasn't quite as up on gender as I am today. There you go. Who knew? At that time, I didn't even think about the possibility of you could still transition and still think of yourself as male. You could transition into a woman's body, but at some point think of yourself as, well, wait a minute. That would be kind of like gender queer or gender fluid even. Carrie's gender fluid. We haven't determined if he's gender queer yet. I mean, if I transition and then begin thinking of myself in a male sense, I guess I'd be a bit gender queer. I don't know. I think of myself as a woman. That's who I am. There are other people, they think differently. That's cool. And if I go back and rewrite this novel, that's something I need to change. that interview process, I was reading it last night going, this would never fly today. It really wouldn't. I was like, oh my God, when I wrote this, I didn't change this shit. I need to go back and change it. So that's kind of where they got their premise from. And am I going to continue discussing this tomorrow? There's a distinct possibility I might. There's a distinct possibility I may actually show you some stuff. So we'll see. The reason I'm doing this is because it makes me understand where I've been and where I'm going. And I think that's important to me because sometimes you kind of lose track of your past. And in order to really think about where my characters are today, I have to think about where I was with those characters back in different times in my life. And this is my way of dealing with it and showing you how I got to where I'm at. And maybe this is something that some writers who are watching this and reading some of the things I've done will come to understand, maybe it's not a bad idea caging off the past. You can always use it. You never know. May not hurt. Okay, so I think I've talked long enough, almost 50 minutes, so I will let you go. Have a good weekend, and I will see you tomorrow.